Hey there, Dengar Stu here. Today's video is about finally launching Renko again, heading out to Lady Musgrave Island on the Great Barrier Reef, and is proudly sponsored by MarineEngine.com. Well, as you can see, we're finally back in the water. It was a big push the last couple of months. We certainly got a lot of big jobs ticked off. There's a few more things to do still, some of them quite big, but you know, the boat's in pretty good shape now, I think, to just get on and enjoy it for a little while. And on that note, first port of call was to head out to Lady Musgrave Island, which is pretty much the southern tip of the Great Barrier Reef. Lady Elliot Island's a little bit further south, but it really is the beginning of it, starting from the south. Launch day left me with slightly mixed feelings. Obviously it's great to have Renko finished and ready to go back in the water, and really looking forward to going up north and seeing the Barrier Reef, but also sad to be saying goodbye to Damien and Jess for now. We'll definitely be stopping in on our way back down the coast to do some work on Brewpeg and hopefully help get them in the water. Who knows, we might both head north a bit and explore the reef with both boats together for a while, which would be fun. They ended up putting 4 slings on Renko simply because they were pulling a bigger boat out straight after we went back in, so they were essentially rigging the travel lift for that boat. But, you know, certainly didn't hurt for us. The plan was always to get everything rigged up and then launch us in the morning on the high tide, but it was pretty funny when we moved about 10 feet and then knock-off time hit.
Staying here. 3 o'clock. love your style. That's gold. It's quitting time.
The next morning, Damien and Jess jumped on board for a coffee and then stayed on board while we headed out to be dropped back in the water. The guys kindly carried Red Dwarf on their forklift for me so that we didn't have too far to walk with it to drop it back in the water. Damien was the picture of concentration, curled up in the bow there, flying the drone while we travelled along. It all starts to feel very real once you're out there hanging over the water, running through your mind, wondering if you've forgotten anything. It was hard not to admire the ROV on the boat tied up next to the travel lift. It was definitely a serious piece of kit. Well, we were off under our own steam again. Certainly a very nice feeling after 2 long months on the hard stand. I'd definitely get used to having Damien leap overboard and tie lines up every time we pull up to a wharf. Due to a small navigational error, it took us about 8 hours to row out to Renko, so we figured by the time we got there it was getting dark, we may as well have a barbecue. Given we were taking off before dawn the next day, we took this opportunity to quickly review some of the footage and share the clips so that I could get on and edit this video before getting back into reception. Huge thanks to Damien and Jess for all the filming they did on the day, made things a lot easier, much appreciated guys.
It would have been nice if you had worn this year's colours like Jess and I.
That's true. And not just steering down while you're
Give it to me, I'll make sure it's in the boat.
Doing the barbecue gave me the opportunity to, yes, slap Damien as he deserves, and also to discuss our Zoolander modelling looks that we're going to be using next year.
Oh, we need to perfect rusty steel.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Is it surprise or is it ultimate disappointment?
I think ultimately it's like typical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You need to throw a tool down on the ground and walk away.
And the tool has to go through the steel.
My short attention span soon got the better of me and I forgot I was barbecuing, but Damien kept an eye on things.
Seems alright.
It's fine.
Of course, none of this stopped me from getting distracted again straight away and talking to Damien about various bits of recording equipment. We're both quite keen to set up spaces where we record more often. Places such as my workbench under the house, Damien's workbench in the end room, recurring places that you can light and mic up properly, for a change.
You know that? Yeah, they're not stupid. They're about $200. Yeah. But if they were, good. But like, rather than spend $200 to figure out if it works, like just.
So the question is, yeah, do you do that or do you do the shotgun across at you?
Yeah.
Doug, oh, is it? No, I think it's off. Is it? Oh no, it is recording. No, it is on. I didn't realise. Nothing to see. Do you like?
Need a fire extinguisher.
Do you like yours well done or well done?
How bad do you like yours,
We left to head off to Lady Musgrave about 1 o'clock in the morning the next morning. It was really about trying to arrive on the high tide and about the middle of the day when the sun's high overhead. Unfortunately, issue with the tacho, which I think is still that alternator problem. I think I'm just going to replace that alternator, get a new one.
Well, reasonably quiet, uneventful night, which is always nice. Sun's up now. Probably about a third to a half of the way to Lady Musgrave. Hoping to get there on the high tide at about 11. Time to wake Vicky up and I'm going to have a sleep.
On the way out to Lady Musgrave, we passed a couple of humpback whales, a mother teaching her calf to tail slap. They are heading south back down to Antarctica after giving birth up north in the warmer waters. By the middle of the day we were getting pretty close to Lady Musgrave Island. The island itself is quite a small part of what's there. The reef that surrounds the island is by far the largest area, and you can see there's a man-made channel in through the reef that lets you go into the lagoon. The channel's marked with a set of port and starboard markers. They kind of look a bit funny, particularly at high tide, because they just look like they're in the middle of the ocean essentially. You can see on the side scan sonar, however, that the bottom's definitely starting to get more structure and become more of a coral reef. There are two more markers inside. One's a second starboard marker and the other is an isolated danger marker. so we went past the starboard and then turned to starboard before we got to the isolated danger marker. Vicky stayed on lookout for shallow areas for bommies as we headed in. Not so important with a boat like Renko where you steer from the front, but if you're in a large sailing vessel and you're right at the back in the cockpit, it's pretty much essential. Saw a guy just leaving, so ducked over and picked up the mooring. Looks very chunky, quite confidence inspiring. And we're a bit closer to some of the reef to have a snorkel around, which is always welcome. It was certainly a beautiful spot to spend a week. I'd happily go back there again any day. Probably will on the way back down the coast. I've left it a bit later than I'd planned, but even from a couple of hours ago in the afternoon, the reef goes this dark colour. It's really hard to see, which is why they say come in when the sun's overhead. You can see what's deep enough to pass over, something that's dark. Anything shallow will be a yellow colour, but once the sun's a bit lower, it all looks dark. So definitely enter when the sun's high, move when the sun's high, come and go, so you can see the reef really clearly. Another great bit of advice I was given is to time your trip for the neap tides, the tides that have relatively low highs. That way you don't get so much of the waves coming over the top of the reef if there happens to be a swell running. Once settled on the mooring, it seemed wrong not to go for a dive with a metal detector, see what's down there. The style of mooring that marine parks have installed is very cool. It's one of the types that screws down into the seabed so you don't have a block and ground chain. Looks like some sort of anode attached to it too. The ground chains on normal moorings damage the seabed quite a bit, so you can see why they've used this style. First find of the day was a flag off a Riviera. Looked like it had been held on with 3 cable ties. They'd all broken. I'm surprised a company like Riviera doesn't use 4 cable ties just to be on the safe side. I found a variety of tin cans on the bottom, as you always do, but I was sort of pleased to see that they were of a certain vintage, mostly from the 80s, so it sort of goes to show how attitudes have changed since the 80s. In uncovering this can, I felt a bit like Walter from The Big Lebowski getting Donnie's ashes all over the dude. Poor sea cucumber. The goby fish, I think they're called. They're very curious. They always seem to just sit there staring at you. tried to pay a little bit more attention to that night's dinner, not repeat my old mistakes. The wind picked up for a couple of the days that we were there, but because we were there on the neap tides, it didn't affect us too badly. Trying to keep you out of the wind here. Sadly, we're at a pretty low tide at the moment, so as the tide comes up, the swell will start coming over the top of the reef, so it's only going to get worse before it gets better. But what I'm going to do is rig up a sea anchor and just see if we can put it on the windward side, just to experiment. I don't know if we need it, but we've been meaning to for a while. Only doing 2 winds. It's not going to be in long enough to really worry. It's not permanent. I just don't want it falling off too easily, that's all. That's our weight for the bottom of the sea anchor. I think maybe an anchor hitch here. So round turn. And then rather than doing 2 half hitches normally, you come through the eye on the first one. So basically round turn, first hitch through the eye, second hitch round. We could whip that to the end here, make it pretty safe, but I think that'll do given the conditions. Down, cleat it off, no locking turns, don't want it jamming. See what happens. All things considered, I was actually pretty happy with the effect that the sea anchor or the drogue had on the roll of the boat. Ideally you would have 2, you'd have 1 at each side, although they do say 1 to the windward side, you know, does help, and it does, absolutely. As well as putting a second drogue on the other side, I think you could also make it more effective by having both the drogues on poles, about the, you know, the beam of the boat long on each side. But given I keep the sea anchor anyway for emergency use, so you're already storing it, it's not a lot of extra equipment to have, and given it did make quite a good difference, I am tempted just to try a second one on the other side. That way you've got a spare sea anchor and you've got the ability to sort of attenuate the roll of the boat a little bit without having lots of extra equipment on board specifically for that task, not really having the poles and that kind of stuff. We'll see. We'll experiment down the track. I may one day do a sort of paravane type stabilizer. Who knows? We'll see. But for now, time to relax. Just finished a little snorkel around the reef. This one over here. Nice little sort of bommy inside the reef. Been reading this book on board, really enjoying it. It's so nice just to be reading, chilling out again. Really good book though. Australian author, Kyle Perry. Didn't know anything about it, just was going to Big W to buy some swimmers actually, and thought, oh, I'll buy some books, and grabbed a winner. Next up we took Red Dwarf to go and take a look at Lady Musgrave Island, see what was there. Some sections of the beach were quite soft sand, but there was also lots of broken off coral around as well. Very nice. Keep it down, mate, I'm filming. I wonder what plant that's from. Looks like a mini coconut. I like your place. Love what you've done with it. This is the lighthouse that's on Lady Musgrave Island. It's certainly good having that beacon if you're navigating around here at night. Hello, you noddies, are you? Don't take that tone with me. Amazing how many of these little fellas live in each tree. This is very cool. There's no mobile or VHF reception here, very limited anyway. So National Marine Parks put tides and wind and weather on a board up here near the toilets on the island, on the quay, which is really cool. There was also a cool sign showing the difference between a continental island and a quay that's ultimately built on top of a reef. It was certainly great having a wander around the island and exploring. There's plenty of options if you want to do a day trip. There's a boat that leaves from Burnett Heads where Damien and Jess are on the hard stand, called Lady Musgrave Experience, and they take 100 or so people out each day. While we're there, we saw a couple of black-tip reef sharks sort of swimming around in the shallows. They're pretty harmless if they're not sort of cornered and feel threatened, so I didn't feel in any way worried about diving knowing they're there. They pretty much just go about their business.
Got my second antenna up too.
You can see here how much more clearly you can see the shallow sections of reef when the sun's high overhead. They really stick out quite clearly. It was also very nice to have the ladder to get up and down. That was definitely a worthwhile addition. Doing the metal detecting here wasn't particularly about finding things of any historical value or monetary value, but it was a good chance to sort of test mucking around with some of the techniques and some of the gear. This is the inside of the old front-loading washing machine that I kept on board for pretty much this purpose. On this dive I could hear bubbles coming from behind me, so I took the BCD off to check, and it looks like there's air leaking out from the first stage regulator. It hasn't been getting a very good wash because of our limited fresh water while I'm living on the boat, so I think I'll need to get it serviced and at least find a way to soak the regulators after each dive. Because of the air leak, I kept a pretty close eye on how much was left in the tank as I continued my impromptu Clean Up Australia dive. Of course, this all happened under the watchful eye of the resident nosy fish. By the end of this dive, I'd actually filled that tub, so I'm glad I brought it down. You know, didn't find anything particularly interesting, but it was nice to get a lot of that rubbish up. This bit actually turned out to be a bit of fiberglass, not sure if it was from a boat or some sort of board. I found a few more pieces the same colour.
Last sunset on Lady Musgrave. Off in the morning into Gladstone to get water and food.
Well, thanks for watching. We're in Gladstone at the moment. Predominantly came in to get water actually. It was interesting to see that was the thing we ran out of that meant we needed to go back to shore. Obviously we've got pretty much infinite electricity with the solar, had plenty of food left as well. So it has got me looking into a water maker. Ultimately this is going to be a work boat, not really a cruising boat, so I don't want to go too far down that track. But having said that, that equipment could always be transferred to a cruising boat later as well, so maybe it is worth it. Alright, well take care, and I will see you next week when I show you our trip to Gladstone and then heading north up to the Keppels through the Narrows. Alright, take care, see you then, bye.